When they finally opened him up, the autopsy found a heart the size of a peppercorn and almost no blood left in the body. This was a man who couldn't chew, who hadn't been able to walk until he was 8 years old, and whose own physicians had decided the only real explanation was witchcraft. And he was the king of Spain. Most history books look at that, and it reads today as tragedy. But on this channel, we're going to read it more like a balance sheet. The usual story blames ignorance. A family so closed off, it couldn't see what it was doing to itself. But that's not quite what happened. The Habsburgs had a motto: Bello gerant alii tu felix, Austria nube. Let others wage war, you happy Austria marry. And that wasn't poetry. It was closer to an operating manual for an entire family. Every marriage was really a piece of land acquired, and every union locked in a line of succession before anyone had to draw a sword. By 1519, that approach had built the first genuinely global empire, stretching across Spain, the Americas, the Netherlands, Austria, and the Kingdom of Naples. And they'd done it without armies, using bloodlines and wedding contracts instead. They didn't so much conquer an empire as marry into one. And then they found they couldn't stop. By the time we're done here, you won't just understand why Charles II's jaw wouldn't close. You'll start to recognize almost any institution, whether it's financial or political or dynastic, that seals itself so tightly around its own bloodline that it eventually starts producing its own bewitched kings. Welcome back to Hidden Forces in History. I'm your host, Jeremy Ryan Slate, CEO of Command Your Brand, and you could check us out over at commandyourbrand.com. So getting back to the Habsburgs. Before any of that mattered, though, the Habsburgs were nobody in particular. And I don't mean that as an insult, because that's actually where this whole thing begins. In 1273, a Swiss count named Rudolf got himself elected Holy Roman Emperor by a group of German princes who specifically wanted a weak king, someone they could control, someone with no real power base of his own. And they chose about as wrong as they possibly could have. Rudolf didn't have an army big enough to just take territory by force, and he didn't have the money to buy it outright either. What he did have was daughters, along with a very clear sense that in medieval Europe, a marriage contract worked like a property deed. So he spent his whole reign arranging marriages that quietly moved land and title and legal claim into Habsburg hands. And he managed it without fighting a single battle. By the time he died in 1291, his family controlled Austria. And again, they hadn't conquered it. They'd married into it. That one move is basically the entire Habsburg story in miniature. Every generation that came after ran the same play. More daughters, more deals. More territory picked up at the altar instead of the battlefield. And for 200 years, it worked without really ever failing. The one who truly perfected this was Maximilian I. He took what had been a regional tactic and turned it into a strategy that covered the whole continent. Maximilian was born in 1459, and when he took control of the Habsburg lands back in the 1480s, he was working with Austria, some parts of what's now Switzerland, and honestly, not much else. By the time he died in 1519, though, his grandchildren were positioned to inherit Spain, the Netherlands, Burgundy, the Kingdom of Naples, and the entire Western Hemisphere. He hadn't fought for any of it. He'd arranged it. The first deal was the one that really mattered. In 1477, the Duke of Burgundy died in battle, leaving no male heir, one daughter, and half of Western Europe already circling the estate. France wanted Burgundy, but Maximilian simply moved faster. He married Mary of Burgundy within 4 months of his father's death. And just like that, the Netherlands, Flanders, Luxembourg, and the richest trading corridor in Europe all transferred to Habsburgs in a single ceremony. That marriage only lasted 5 years before Mary died in a riding accident. But by then, the territory was already locked into Habsburg hands. And Maximilian didn't spend long mourning. because he was already negotiating for Spain. The Spanish deal is the one that changed everything. Ferdinand and Isabella, the same monarchs who funded Columbus, had a daughter named Joanna, and Maximilian had a son named Philip. So the arrangement was pretty simple. Philip marries Joanna, and the Spanish inheritance comes over to the Habsburgs. Then Philip died young, and Joanna went through a mental collapse serious enough that her family locked her away. She spent the last 50 years of her life confined to a tower in Tordesillas, and history remembers her as Joanna la Loca, Joanna the Mad. The Spanish crown never actually passed to either of them. It went straight to their son, Charles I of Spain, who was also Charles V as Holy Roman Emperor, came into his titles at 17 years old, and he controlled Spain, the Americas, the Netherlands, Austria, the Kingdom of Naples, and big stretches of North Africa on top of that. No single ruler in the whole European history had ever held this much territory at one time. Not Charlemagne, not Caesar, nobody. He built the entire thing on his grandfather's marriage formula. And right at the peak, at the moment of maximum success, the flaw buried inside that formula started to show for the first time. The deepest problem here was really the question of succession. What had to happen once all that territory was assembled? Holding the land was never the hard part. There's a document from 1549 called the Pragmatic Sanction, and most people have never heard of it. What it did was bind the 17 provinces of the Habsburg Netherlands together, so they'd pass intact and undivided to a single heir, and it became a kind of template for how the family thought about inheritance everywhere else. No splitting things up, no subdividing. The whole patrimony stays in one piece. Now on the surface that sounds like responsible governance, but in practice it turned to a slow-motion catastrophe, because if the territory couldn't be divided, then the heir had to come from within the bloodline. And a bloodline only holds so many eligible candidates. And by this point, most of them were already Habsburgs anyway. Charles actually understood this arithmetic himself before he abdicated in 1556. So he split the empire administratively, giving his son Philip Spain and the Western Territories, and handing his brother Ferdinand of Austria and the East. So now you've got two branches, both of them Habsburg, both of them still running the exact same marriage strategy, which meant that whenever either branch needed their heirs strong enough to hold it together, there was an obvious solution sitting right there. They could just marry each other. The word for this in genetics is consanguinity, which means blood relation. Every one of us carries 2 copies of each gene, from each parent. And when those 2 parents are closely related, the odds go up that both copies are carrying the same mutation. Most mutations are harmless, but some of them aren't. And the harmful ones usually stay hidden as long as you've got 2 different versions of a gene, one working and one faulty. The working copy just covers for the damage. But once both parents are carrying the same faulty version, which is exactly what happens when they share the same ancestry, both copies can switch on at the same time. And at that point, there's nothing left to cover for it. That's really what produces inbreeding and health problems. There's nothing mysterious about it. It's just probability running in the wrong direction for long enough. And the Habsburgs ran that probability in the wrong direction for 2 full centuries. The jaw itself showed up early. Maximilian I already had it. And if you look at his portraits, you can see that slightly extended lower jaw that would go on to become the family's visual signature across 6 generations of official painting. In him, it was still subtle, a mild protrusion that gave his face a certain set to it. His physicians noticed it, and his artists mostly painted around it. By Philip I, it was more pronounced, and by Philip II, it had gotten severe enough that he needed specific accommodations just to get through a meal. The Habsburg jaw, which technically gets called a mandibular prognosticism. It's basically the lower jaw growing out past the upper. And it doesn't only change the face. Once it gets severe enough, the upper and lower teeth stop meeting altogether. So chewing becomes inefficient. Swallowing gets harder. And eating ends up taking longer while giving you less nutrition for the effort. The thing the portrait painters were treating as a charming little family quirk was really a metabolic problem building up across generations. And that's going to matter a great deal when we get to Charles II. Philip II is the hinge point of the whole story. He inherited Spain in 1556 and then ruled for 42 years. And he was genuinely competent, a careful and deliberate kind of ruler. He built the Escorial, this palace and monastery up in the mountains outside Madrid, sealed off from the outside world and organized entirely around one premise: that power flows from God down to the king, and then through the institutions that he controls. And the design of the place wasn't accidental. The Escorial was a physical statement that the system was closed, that it was complete, and that it needed no input from anywhere outside itself. Philip understood the empire as a closed system, and he governed it exactly that way. He also married his own niece. His fourth wife, Anna of Austria, was the daughter of his sister. That marriage needed a formal papal dispensation, which was basically written permission from Rome admitting the union was technically incestuous, but treating it as strategically necessary to keep the Catholic Habsburg line going. And the church granted it, the way it always did. Because from Rome's point of view, the alternative, Habsburg lands slipping to a Protestant line, was far worse of an outcome. Philip genuinely believed that he was protecting the bloodline, and in a sense, he was. He was also concentrating a whole set of genetic risks that wouldn't fully show themselves for another 2 generations. Spain under Philip II was the dominant power on Earth, and the silver coming out of the Americas, pulled through a forced labor system called the militia, is what financed the European wars that kept the whole empire held together. The system was producing. And then in 1588, the Armada sailed for England and never came back. That's roughly 130 ships and 30,000 men. And in the end, the storms off the Irish coast did more damage to them than the English cannons ever did. Philip got the news back at the Escorial, and he reportedly said, "I sent my ships against men, not against the winds and the waves of God." And then he shut the door and just kept on governing. He left the empire's strategic position exactly where it was, and he never touched the marriage policy. In his mind, the system was sound, and the Armada had just been a fluke. The Dutch revolt, meanwhile, had already been grinding on for 20 years at that point. The northern provinces, which were the richest trading territories in the whole empire, were well into what would eventually stretch out into an 80-year war of independence. And years before, Philip's answer to all of it had been to send the Duke of Alba in with a standing army and a policy of public executions, which really only accelerated the rebellion. So now it's more silver coming out of the Americas to pay for the crackdown. More money poured into wars that force what was never going to win. This is more or less what Paul Kennedy called imperial overstretch. The point where a great power's commitments start to outrun the economy underneath them, and it begins spending its own future just to defend the present. The empire had been built on contracts, and now it was trying to hold itself together with armies instead. That's more than a tactical shift. It's a system quietly admitting that its own logic has stopped working. Philip II died in 1598, and left Spain to his son Philip III, who was 20 years old, fond of ceremony, and almost completely uninterested in the actual work of governing. He appointed a man named Francisco Gomez de Sandoval as his chief minister, and this was the first of the great Validos. A Valido was essentially a royal favorite who got handed real executive power. The king would sign the documents, and the Valido would actually run the state. And you shouldn't read this as occupation in the modern sense. It's more like the system quietly adapting to a problem it couldn't say out loud. The bloodline had to sit on the throne, because the entire legal and religious foundation of the empire depended on it. But the actual man on the throne was less and less capable of governing. So the capacity to govern just migrated somewhere else. The bloodline kept the title, and the Valido held the real power. And that gap between who legally held the authority and who actually exercised it kept widening with every generation that came after. Philip III's son was Philip IV, And Philip IV had a Valido of his own named Gaspar de Guzman, the Count Duke of Olivar. And Olivar was probably the most capable administrator Spain ever produced in the entire 17th century. J.H. Eliot, whose biography of him is still the standard account, frames him more or less in that way, as a reformer who saw a painful clarity with exactly what was wrong with the empire, and still couldn't budge the institutions standing in his way. He understood that his empire was overstretched and badly underfinanced, and he spent something like 20 years trying to reform it. He proposed spreading the tax burden across the Habsburg territories instead of dumping it on Castile, and he wanted an army in every region that would pay into it proportionally. Beyond that, he was trying to centralize the bureaucracy just enough that you could actually govern a continent with it. And every single proposal failed. The regional nobility blocked him, the church blocked him, and the whole institutional layer the Habsburg had originally used to build the empire, the councils and the church courts and the structures of noble privilege, had hardened into veto powers that no reform could get past. Olivar fell from power in 1643, disgraced and exiled and pretty much broken. And Philip IV spent the last 20 years of his reign just watching the whole thing come apart. The 30 Years' War ended in 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia, and Spain was still standing at the end of it. But it wasn't the same thing it had been back in 1556. It was smaller now, poorer, running on debt, and sitting on top of territories that increasingly wanted out. And the man who was going to inherit all of that had already been born. Charles II was born November 6, 1661, to Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria. And Mariana was Philip's own niece, and the daughter of his sister. So this is the same close relation move that Philip II had already made with Anna of Austria a generation before, except that by 1661, the family tree had been folding back on itself through 4 straight generations of deliberate cousin and uncle-niece marriages. The term geneticists use for this is the coefficient of the inbreeding. It measures what share of a person's genes trace back to a common ancestor, who show up on both sides of the family tree at once. For 2 completely unrelated people, that number is basically 0. For first cousins, it's about 6.25%. And for full sibling union, it's around 25%. So Charles II's coefficient came out to 25.4%, which is actually higher than you'd get from siblings. And no single marriage produced that. It built up across 9 generations of strategic marriages, all folding back to the same small family pool. That number, by the way, comes from a Spanish geneticist named Gonzalo Alvarez and his team at the University of Santiago de Compostela, who published the full analysis back in 2009. They traced all of Charles II's ancestral lines back across 16 generations, and more than 3,000 relatives in total. And the same individuals kept turning up on both sides of the family tree over and over. Philip I, the man whose Castile marriage had kicked off the entire empire, appears in Charles II's ancestry again and again. So by the end, the shape of it stops looking like a tree and starts looking a lot more like a closed loop. Charles wasn't expected to survive infancy at all. He was born premature and so physically fragile that they baptized him immediately after delivery, on the assumption that he wouldn't last the week. But he did survive. And the life that followed was basically a catalog of everything that Closed Loop had produced. He couldn't walk until he was 8 years old. He didn't speak clearly until about 10, and his head was noticeably too large for the rest of his body. His tongue was enlarged enough that both eating and speaking took visible, labored effort, and his lower jaw extended so far past the upper one that his teeth never actually made contact, which meant he couldn't chew solid food at all. So he was kept on a near-liquid diet for most of his life, taking in less nutrition in a day than an ordinary working-class Spaniard. He had frequent seizures. His physicians wrote down that he vomited habitually, his digestive system unable to fully handle even that little that he did manage to get down. He went bald before his mid-30s, and he was tired in this deep, constant way that no amount of rest ever seemed to fix. So by the time he was a teenager, the most powerful empire in the Western world was being run on behalf of a king who couldn't physically get through a meal without help. And the court had no real way to acknowledge any of this. The divine right of kings, the religious ideal that justified absolute monarchy in the first place, demanded that the king actually be the king. He had to be the person genuinely ruling, not a symbol and not a figurehead. But in reality, Charles II's mother, Mariana, served as regent all through his minority, and a rotating set of Validos and court favorites made the actual executive decisions. The whole court organized itself around working around his incapacity without ever naming it aloud, because to name it, you'd have to name the cause. And naming the cause would mean admitting that the marriage strategy, the very thing that had built the empire, was also the thing that had produced a king who couldn't rule it. And that wasn't just a conversation about the court was willing to have. So instead, they called it witchcraft. Serious investigations actually got commissioned over it, and 2 separate exorcisms were performed on the King of Spain himself. The Inquisition, whose entire job was to identify and root out threats to the Catholic order, got brought in to investigate whether supernatural forces were behind the king's condition. And they concluded that he'd been bewitched through a cup of chocolate that somebody had given him as a child. The explanation they landed on, demonic affliction, was in some way exactly the explanation they needed. It placed the cause somewhere outside the system, which meant the system never had to turn around and examine itself. Charles II married twice over his life, first to Marie-Louise of Orleans in 1679, and then after her death to Mariana of Neuburg in 1689. But he was impotent, and neither marriage ever produced a child. And this was the final consequence of the whole operating system. The marriage strategy had been built specifically to generate heirs and lock in territorial continuity. And now it had delivered a king who couldn't generate an heir at all. The exact thing the system existed to prevent, the line ending and the territory breaking apart and the empire dissolving, was now basically guaranteed. Every major power in Europe knew Charles II was going to die without an heir. They'd honestly known it for years, and they were already negotiating what came next, long before he was anywhere near the grave. So the succession crisis, when it finally came, caught nobody off guard. In a sense, it had been on the calendar for years. Both France and Austria had legal claims to the Spanish throne, running through the Habsburg women who'd married out of the direct line in earlier generations. Louis XIV of France was married to the Spanish Infanta, Maria Theresa, the daughter of Philip IV, and the Austrian Habsburgs had a candidate of their own coming through a separate branch. So you've got 2 great powers, and one dying empire sitting between them. And the negotiations were happening while Charles II was still alive, still technically reigning. Through a series of partition treaties that carved up the Spanish inheritance like an estate inventory taken before the owner had ever stopped breathing. England and the Dutch Republic were part of these talks too. The working assumption behind all of it was that the empire would have to be distributed, and no single power could inherit the whole thing and tip the balance of the continent. Then Charles II found out about the partition treaties, and it made him furious. He could live with the idea of succession planning in the abstract. What he couldn't stand was that they'd arranged the entire thing behind his back, without ever consulting him. So in the final months of his life, knowing that he was dying, and determined to preserve the thing the system had always demanded, which was territorial integrity, he signed a will naming Philip of Anjou, the grandson of Louis XIV, his sole heir. And Philip was a Bourbon, not a Habsburg at all, which meant that with one signature, the Habsburg line in Spain had come to an end. Charles II died on November 1st, 1700, at 38 years old, and the autopsy his court physicians carried out recorded exactly what I described at the very start. They found a heart about the size of a peppercorn, corroded lungs, intestines full of putrid water, and a brain that, in their notes, had been reduced to a liquid state. The body of the lapsed Habsburg King of Spain was, in a real sense, the whole system's balance sheet laid open on the table. The war that broke out after his death lasted 13 years. The War of Spanish Succession pulled in England, the Dutch Republic, the Austrian Habsburg, Portugal, Savoy, and eventually most of the continent in one form or another. It produced some of the bloodiest set-pieces battles that Europe had ever seen to that point, at places like Blenheim and Malplaquet, names that basically became bywords for slaughter. And it ended with the treaties of 1713 and 1714, Utrecht first, then Rahlstatt and Baden, redistributing whatever was left of the Spanish Empire and confirming the new order in Europe. Spain got to keep its monarchy, and Philip of Anjou became Philip V of Spain. But the empire itself lost the Netherlands, Naples, Sardinia, and Milan to Austria, and Gibraltar went to Britain. And the empire that Maximilian I had assembled in 2 centuries of marriage contracts got legally taken apart in about 18 months of treaty negotiations. The thing that had taken 200 years to build had needed only about 2 generations to rot from the inside, and nothing outside it really did the damage. The system did it to itself. So this pattern is sitting underneath all of it. The Habsburgs built an empire by turning the bloodline itself into the asset. Every marriage was a piece of territory acquired, and every heir was a guarantee that the whole thing would continue. And that logic actually held up fine as long as the bloodline was still expanding, still taking in new families, new genetics, new administrative capacity from outside. But empires don't expand forever. Rome showed us that. There's a passage from Ibn Khaldun, writing all the way back in the 14th century, long before anyone had a word like genetics, where he puts the natural lifespan of a ruling dynasty at roughly 3 generations. You get the ones who built it, the ones who imitate the builders, and finally the ones who inherit the whole thing and quietly let it fall apart. He was really describing the loss of what he called solidarity. But the shape he's sketching there is the same shape we're watching play out with the Habsburgs. At a certain scale, the appetite for acquisition just reverses. The priority quietly shifts from expanding to preserving. And for a system built on a bloodline, preserving means keeping the asset locked inside the line. No outside blood coming in, no dilution, no loss of control. So the very same logic that assembled the empire turned into the logic that destroyed it. Because once you close a system off this tightly, once self-continuity becomes the main thing it's optimizing for, you lose the ability to take in information from the outside the loop. You stop being able to respond to the world is actually doing out there. And you start producing administrators who can't administer, kings who can't rule, and eventually jaws that won't even close. And this really isn't only a Habsburg problem. It's any institution that's been running too long. And ask the same basic question about it. Who it is actually built to serve at this point? You've got the corporate board that fills every vacancy of the same social circle, the same alumni pool, the same 20 or so families that have built rotating through the same seats for 30 years. You've got the political dynasty that keeps recycling the same handful of surnames across 4 generations of elected office, getting a little more insulated from the people it supposedly represents with each cycle. You've got the financial firm that keeps promoting from within, the people who protect how things already work, and never really the ones who point out where it's failing. And you've got the central bank that's run for more than a century without a full public audit of its monetary operations. There'd be plenty to find if anyone actually looked. It stays that way because the institution's first obligation, the one that quietly outranks its official mandate, is to the whole network of institutions that depend on it, staying exactly as is. None of these are cartoonish villains sitting around running some deliberate conspiracy. They're closed systems, just following their own survival logic. Every closed system eventually starts optimizing for its own survival over actually doing its job. And any closed system that runs long enough without correction from the outside will, at some point, produce its own version of Charles II. It won't always be a king with a jaw that won't close. Sometimes it's a central bank policy that can't adapt to the very conditions that its own models predicted. Sometimes it's a political class that keeps getting the same signal from the population and keeps holding back the same non-response. And sometimes it's a currency system that just keeps issuing debt against collateral that doesn't really exist anymore at the values being claimed for it. Because to correct the valuation would mean admitting the collateral was always just the inner circle. And the inner circle can't audit itself. It's really the same playbook, just running in a different century. The Habsburg jaw is such a famous deformity mainly because it's visible. You can literally trace it through the portraits, watching Maximilian's subtle little protrusion around 1500 turn into Philip II's accommodated underbite, and then into Charles II's severe extension, the kind that forced him into a liquid diet just to stay alive. It's the system closing in on itself, painted in oil, generation after generation, sitting right there for anyone to look at the whole sequence as a sequence, instead of a set of separate portraits. But the jaw itself was only ever the output, the visible symptom. The actual disease was the operating principle behind it. Bella gerant alii to felix Austria nube. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. It worked for 200 years because it was a system that could outmaneuver raw force using contracts. And it failed in the 3rd century for a very simple reason, which is that contracts require 2 parties. Once the only acceptable parties were already inside your own bloodline, the contract stops being an agreement with the outside world and turns into a document the system is just issuing to itself. It's a loop dressed up as a policy, a closed circuit still calling itself an empire. So in the end, the Habsburg jaw was a lot more than a genetic curiosity. It was the state itself becoming physically unable to feed the very population it ruled. This has been Hidden Forces in History. I'm Jeremy Ryan Slate. Please like this video, leave us a comment, and smash the subscribe button if you want more Hidden Forces in History.